it will have justified its existence, and will perish from the earth. Even as Patches spoke, he saw something just beyond the approaching man that made him start, as if to rise to his feet. It was the unmistakable face of Yokpai Joe, who, from behind an oak brush, was watching the professor. Patches glanced at Kitty, saw that she had not noticed. Before the young woman could reply to her companion's derisive remarks, the object which had prompted his comments arrived within speaking distance. "I trust I'm not intruding," began the professor in his small, thin voice. Then as Patches, his eyes still on the oak brush, stood up, the little man added, with hasty condescension, "Keep your seat, man. Keep your seat. I assure you it's not my purpose to deprive you of Miss Reed's company." Patches grinned. By that, my man, he knew that Kitty had not enlightened her teacher as to the typical cowboy's real character. "Well, that's all right, Professor," he said awkwardly. "I just seen a maverick over yonder place. I reckon I'd better mosey along and have a closer look at him. Me and Kitty here weren't talking about nothing important nohow, just gossiping about. I reckon she'd rather go home with you anyhow, and it's all right with me." "Maverick?" questioned the professor. "And what, may I ask, is a maverick?" "It's a critter which don't belong to nobody," answered Patches, moving towards his horse. At the same moment, Kitty, who had risen, was looking in the direction from which the professor had come, exclaimed, "Why, there's Yokpai Joe, Patches. What's he doing here?" She pointed, and the professor, looking, caught a glimpse of Joe's back as the fellow was slinking over the ridge. "I reckon maybe he wants to see me about something or other," Patches returned as he mounted his horse. "Anyway, I'm a-going over to look that way anyway. So long." Patches rode up to Joe just as the Tally Holt man was regaining his horse on the other side of the ridge. "Hey, Joe," said the cross-triangle rider easily. The wretched outcast was so shaken and confused that he could scarcely find the stirrup with his foot, and his face was pale and twitching with excitement. He looked at Patches wildly, but spoke in a sullen tone. What's he doing here? What does he want? How did he get in this country, anyhow?" Patches was amazed, but spoke calmly. "Who do you mean, Joe?" "I mean that man back there, Parkhill. Professor Parkhill. What's he a-looking for hanging round here? You can tell him it ain't no use, He stopped suddenly, with a characteristic look of cunningness, turned away. Patches rode beside him for some distance, but nothing he could say would persuade the wretched creature to explain. "Yeah, I know you're my friend all right, Patches," he answered. "You sure been mighty friendly to me, but I ain't forgetting it. But I ain't telling nobody, and it ain't gonna do you no good to keep asking about me, and don't ask him neither." "I'm not gonna ask Professor Parkhill anything, Joe," said Patches shortly. You ain't?" "Certainly not, if you don't want me to know. I'm not trying to find out about anything that's not my business." Joe looked at him with a cunning leer. "Oh, you ain't, is you? Nick lows that you're sure." Again he caught himself. "But I ain't telling nobody for nothing." "Well, have I ever asked you anything?" demanded Patches. No, you ain't, that's right. You've always been square with me, Patches, and I ain't forgetting it. Be you sure enough my friend, Patches? Honest to God, now, be you?" His question was pitiful, and Patches assured the poor fellow that he had no wish to do anything but be his friend, if only would Yokpai Joe accept his help. "Then," said Joe pleadingly, "if you mean all that you've been saying about wanting to help me, you do something for me right now." "What can I do for you, Joe?" "You can promise that you won't say nothing to nobody about him and me back there." Patches, to demonstrate his friendliness, answered without thought. "Certainly, I'll promise that, Joe."
You won't tell nobody?"
"Nope, I won't say a word." The poor fellow's face revealed his gratitude.
"I'm obliged to you, Patches, I sure am, and I ain't forgetting nothing either. You're my friend all right, and I'm yours. I gotta be a-hitting it out now. Nick just naturally give me hell for being gone so long."
"Goodbye, Joe."
So long, Patches. Don't you get to thinking that I'm forgetting how you and me are friends."
When Patches reviewed the incident, as he rode back to the ranch, he questioned if he had done right in promising Joe. But after all, he reassured himself he was under no obligations to interfere with what was clearly none of his business. He could not see that the manor in any possible way touched his employer's interests. As he reflected, he was already tried the useless experiment of meddling with other people's affairs, and he did not care to repeat the experience. That evening, Patches asked Phil's permission to go to Prescott the next day. It'd be the first time he had been to town since his coming to the ranch, and the foreman readily granted his request. A few minutes later, as Phil passed through the kitchen, Miss Baldwin remarked,
"I wonder what Patches is feeling so gay about. Ever since he got home from the rodeo, he's been a-singing and a-whistling and grinning to himself all the time. He went out to the corral just now as merry as a lark."
Phil laughed. "Anyone would be glad to be through with that rodeo, Mother. Besides, he's going to town tomorrow."
"Is he? Well, you mark my words, son. There's something up to make him feel as good as he does at the moment."
And then, when Phil had gone out into the yard, Professor Parkhill found him.
"Mr. Acton," began the guest timidly, "there's a little matter of which I should speak to you about."
"Very well, sir."
"I feel that it'd be better for me to speak to you rather than Mr. Baldwin, because you're younger and will, I'm sure, understand more readily."
"All right, what is it, Professor?" asked Phil encouragingly, wondering at the man's manner.
"Do you mind walking a little way down the road?"
As they strode towards the gate to the meadow road, the professor continued,
"I think you should tell me about your man Patches."
Phil looked at his companion sharply. "Well, what about him?"
I trust you will not misunderstand my interest, Mr. Acton, when I say that it also includes Mrs. Reed."
Phil stopped short. Instantly, Mrs. Baldwin's remarks about Patch's happiness, his own confessions that he had given up all hope of winning Kitty, and the thought of the friendship which he had seen developing during the past months, with the realization that Patches belonged to that world to which Kitty aspired, all swept through his mind. He was looking at the man beside him so intently that the professor said again uneasily,
"I trust, Mr. Acton, that you'll understand."
Phil laughed shortly. "I think I do, but just the same you'd better explain it. What about Patches and Miss Reed, sir?" The professor told them how he found them together that afternoon. "Is that all?" laughed Phil.
"But surely, Mr. Acton, you do not think that a man of that fellow's brutal instincts is fit to associate with a young woman of Mrs. Reed's character and refinement?"
"Perhaps not," admitted Phil, still laughing. "But I guess that Kitty can take care of herself."
"I do not agree with you, sir," said the other authoritatively. "A young woman of Mrs. Reed's spirituality and worldly inexperience might always be, to a certain extent, injured by contrast with such illiterate, unrefined, and I have no doubt morally deficient characters."
"But look here, Professor," returned Phil, still grinning. "What do you expect me to do about it? I'm not Kitty Reed's guardian. Why don't you talk to her yourself?"
"Really," returned the little man, There are reasons why I do not see my way clear to such a course. I had hoped that you might keep an eye on the fellow and, if necessary, use your authority over him to prevent such incidences in the future."
"I'll see what I can do," answered Phil, thinking how the dean would enjoy the joke. "But look here, Kitty was with you when you got to the ranch. What became of Patches? Run, did he, when you appeared on the scene?"
"Oh, no, he went away with the Maverick."
"Went away with a maverick? What in heaven's name do you mean by that?"
"That's what your fellow Patches said. Mrs. Reed told me his name was Joe something."
Phil was not laughing now. The fun of the situation had vanished. "Was it Yokpai Joe?" he demanded.
"Yes, that was it. I'm quite certain that was his name. He belongs to Tail End Mountain, I think Miss Reed said. You've such curious names in this country."
"And Patches went away with them, did you say?"
"Oh, yes. The fellow seemed to be hiding in the bushes when we discovered him, and when Miss Reed asked what he was doing there, your man said that he had come to see him about something. They went away together, I believe."
As soon as he could escape from the professor, Phil went straight to Patches, who was in his room reading. The man looked up with a welcoming smile as Phil entered, but as he saw the foreman's face, his smile vanished quickly, and he laid aside his book. "Patches," said Phil abruptly, "what's this talk of the professor about you and Yokpai Joe?" "I don't know what the professor's talking," Patches said coldly, as though he did not exactly like the tone of Phil's question. "He said that Joe was sneaking about in the bush over on the ridge wanting to see you about something," returned Phil. "Joe was certainly over there on the ridge, and he may have wanted to see me. At any rate, I saw him." "Well, I've got to ask you what sort of business you have with that Tally-Holt thief that makes it necessary for him to sneak around the bush for a meeting with you. If he wants to see you, why hasn't he come to the ranch like a man?" Honorable Patches looked at the dean's foreman straight in the eyes as he answered in a tone that he had never used before in speaking to Phil. "And I have an answer, sir, that my business with Yokpai Joe is entirely personal, and that it has no relation whatsoever to your business as the foreman of this ranch. As to why Joe didn't come to the house, you must ask him. I don't know." "Are you refusing to explain?" demanded Phil. "I certainly refuse to discuss Joe Dryden's personal affairs that, so far as I can see, are of no importance to anyone but himself, with you, or anyone else, just as I should refuse to discuss any of your private affairs with which I happen, by some chance, to be in a way familiar. I have made all the explanations necessary when I say that my business with him has nothing to do with your business. You have no right to ask me anything further." "I have the right to fire you," retorted Phil angrily. Patches smiled as he answered gently, "You have the right, Phil, but you won't use it." "And why not?" "Because you're not that kind of a man, Phil Acton," answered Patches slowly. "You know perfectly well that if you discharge me because of my friendship with poor Yokpai Joe, no ranch in this part of the country will ever give me a job. You are too honest yourself to condemn any man on mere suspicion, and you're too much of a gentleman to damn any simply because he, too, aspires to that distinction." "Very well, Patches," Phil returned with less heat. "But I want you to understand one thing. I am responsible for the Cross Triangle property, and there's no friendship in the world strong enough to influence me in the slightest degree when it comes to question of Uncle Will's interests. Do you understand that?" "I got that months ago, Phil." Without another word, the dean's foreman left the room. Patches sat for some time considering the situation, And now and then his lips curled in the old self-mocking smile, realizing that he was caught in a trap of circumstances, and he found a curious humor in his predicament. End of chapter 11.